Have you ever wondered why the Bible speaks about a mysterious city called Babylon at the very end of history? Not ancient Babylon, the empire that fell thousands of years ago, but a different Babylon. A symbolic one. A system so powerful that the book of Revelation describes it as influencing kings, nations, economies, and even religion across the entire world. And the question that naturally arises is this. If the original Babylon was destroyed long ago, what is this Babylon that appears again in the final pages of the Bible? To understand that, we need to take a journey through history, prophecy, and symbolism, because the story of Babylon did not end in antiquity. In many ways, the Bible suggests that its spirit never disappeared. Let's begin at the beginning. The first appearance of Babylon's ideology in the Bible happens long before the empire itself even existed. It happens in Genesis, in the story of the Tower of Babel. After the flood, humanity gathered in one place and decided to build a tower that would reach the heavens. Their goal was simple but profound. They wanted to make a name for themselves and establish unity without God. In response, God confused their languages and scattered the people across the earth. That city became known as Babel, the origin of what would later become Babylon. This moment establishes the first key principle. Babylon represents humanity's attempt to create power, unity, and civilization without submission to God. It is not just a place, it is a mindset. Centuries later, that mindset becomes a literal empire. Ancient Babylon rises under kings like Nebuchadnezzar and becomes one of the most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. It conquers nations, destroys Jerusalem, and takes the Jewish people into exile. But even at the height of its power, the prophets warned that Babylon represented something deeper than political dominance. It symbolized arrogance, idolatry, and rebellion against God. And eventually, just as prophecy predicted, the empire fell. To most historians, that was the end of Babylon's story. But the Bible reveals something fascinating. Although the empire collapsed, the symbol of Babylon remained alive in prophecy. When we open the book of Revelation, written more than 600 years after the fall of ancient Babylon, we encounter the name again. But this time, it is described in a very different way. Revelation chapter 17 introduces a mysterious figure called Babylon the Great. She is described symbolically as a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, dressed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and precious stones. In her hand is a golden cup filled with abominations. The symbolism is striking. The woman represents influence, seduction, and spiritual corruption. The beast represents political power. Together, they form an alliance between religious influence and worldly authority. But the most shocking detail comes next. Revelation says that this Babylon is not just a city, it is a system that influences the entire world. Kings collaborate with it, nations drink from its influence, and people everywhere become intoxicated with its power and luxury. Then the prophecy shifts from religion and politics to economics. In Revelation chapter 18, Babylon is described as the center of a vast global trade network. Merchants grow rich because of it. Luxury goods flow through it. The entire economic system seems connected to its prosperity. And suddenly, the prophecy takes a dramatic turn. Without warning, Babylon collapses. In a single hour, according to the text, the entire system falls. Kings mourn its destruction. Merchants weep because their trade disappears. Ship captains watch from a distance as smoke rises from the fallen city. The image is powerful. What seemed invincible collapses almost instantly. The message of the prophecy is clear. Any system built on corruption, exploitation, and spiritual deception cannot stand forever. But here is the most important question. If Babylon in Revelation is symbolic, what exactly does it represent? Many scholars and theologians believe Babylon represents a global system of power that combines political influence, economic control, and spiritual corruption. It is not limited to a single nation or city. Instead, it describes a structure of human civilization that prioritizes wealth, control, and self-exaltation above truth and righteousness. In other words, Babylon becomes a symbol of the world when it organizes itself without God at the center, the same spirit that first appeared in the Tower of Babel. And that is why the prophecy ends with a call. In Revelation 18, a voice from heaven declares, "Come out of her, my people, so that you do not share in her sins." The message is not just about the fall of a system. It is about a decision each person must make. The book of Revelation invites readers to recognize the difference between two kingdoms, the kingdom of human power and the kingdom of God. In the end, Babylon falls. But the story does not end in destruction. Immediately after the fall of Babylon, Revelation describes something completely different, the arrival of a new city, the New Jerusalem. While Babylon represents pride, corruption, and human ambition, the New Jerusalem represents restoration, justice, and the fulfillment of God's plan. And that contrast may be the central message of the entire prophecy. History is moving toward a moment when the systems built purely on human power will collapse. But what is built on truth will remain. So, if this study has blessed you, share it with someone. Help us spread this truth. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support our ministry.